In this short tutorial, we'll use SQL Server Management Studio to create a new database table using the data definition language, otherwise known as the create table statement. Before we start, what we're going to do is refer to our entity relationship diagram for the structure that we want to create. So in this case, I'm going to build the courses entity with a SQL script. So what we're going to do is I'm going to follow along on my other screen with my diagram. I'm going to go to New Query, and the first thing to note is to make sure that you're in the right database. Since I was already clicked on a folder under the database I wish to create this under, which is Dr. Wolfe's College database, my new query opened up in that session, and you can see that here in the drop down. That's very important. And always it's a good idea to be safe. You could always use the name of the database as the first command you create when you're building out your script. So by putting that there, it's going to make sure my session will be in that database so when I execute my command. Now the create table statement works like this. Create table, the name of your table, courses, and what you're going to do, follow that with a parenthesis and then your field names. My first field name, or my attribute for my first column, will be course ID. That's going to be, in this case, I'm going to do an integer, okay, and it's going to be the primary key as well. So what I can do here, there's a few ways to do primary keys in SQL Server scripts. I'll show you this way first, and then I'll show you another way in a minute. So course ID, it's going to be an integer, it's going to be the primary key. The course name will be my next field. That's going to be a varchar, and that's going to be a size that's up to 100 characters, and it's also going to be required, so I'm going to make it not null. That means it's going to have to be filled in. Course description will be my next field. I'm going to do a varchar max. That'll allow me to have paragraphs of text about the course, and then I'm going to have credit hours as my last field according to my diagram. That's going to be an integer, and I'm also going to make that not null. The course description, I'm going to allow it to go in as null, and you might be wondering why that's the case. Well, if someone's just setting up a new course and the description hasn't been written yet, we're going to leave that as a field that can be empty at first, and then someone can go back in and modify it later on. So let's show you the option of a field being null versus not null here in my script. Then essentially here, just a couple other things to note is that with SQL and here with SQL Server Management Studio in your query designer, you can organize your scripts to be readable, whatever works for you. I always like to indent my code and use good coding practices even when I write my SQL scripts. So I'm just going to indent it, make it be readable, verify it all before I actually run it. And then originally I had created my other table as TBL students. So from a naming convention, I'm going to clean that up a little bit and do TBL courses. A little different than what my diagram had, but just name the object with the identifier in front of it. I mean, we know when we're working with it, we're working with a table. If I put a semicolon at the end in SQL Server doesn't mandate it. It's just another good practice to get into because that terminates the command and then the next one would execute. The query editor in SQL Server, it's a little easy to work with and flexible at times versus some other tools like if you're working with MySQL and in Oracle environments, those semicolons become critically important. It won't know where your commands actually terminate, so it's a good habit to get into. Additionally, I like to highlight the commands I want to execute. I don't recommend leaving extra commands in your query editor, but at times individuals will do that. It's risky because if you don't highlight what you want to execute, and if you just click execute, everything here in your command window will actually execute in SQL Server. So for folks that are new, I just advise that you be cautious around it. I always like to just say, get in the practice of highlighting what you want to run and then clicking execute to do so. And that'll make sure that you don't accidentally run anything. So if we click execute, and if all goes well, we'll see commands completed successfully. And basically, I ensured that I was in the right database and I created my structure. Over here under tables, if I right click and refresh now, you'll see my courses table that I just created. Okay, so it's there, it's available to me, and if I was to expand it, you'll hopefully see the columns with the settings of null and not null respectively, and the primary key set. This is how you create a table using the data definition language and the create script. You may also wonder, what do I do with existing structures? What if I wanted to see how those were created that maybe already existed in my database as a guide? So what I'll do real quick, I'll show you, because I have another structure in my diagram here, faculty, which is very similar to students if you look at it in terms of fields available. And I just want to maybe use that existing structure and create a new one off of it and look at an existing script. So I can do here with SQL Server, I'm going to close this query window and hit no. And perhaps consider saving that if you wanted to recreate that object in another database. But what I can do here as my existing students table, if I right click on it, we can go to script table as, create to, new query editor window. And SQL Server will show us a create table script for that table that already exists. Now, I want to just kind of point out when it does that, it generates it, and here's a SQL comment that's in green. That's a multi-line comment in SQL, as I can put this on many lines and you can see that. And that's done basically with a / and an asterisk, so you can put additional comments in here. Some database settings, again, and you didn't see me do those when I wrote my script, so they're optional, but they're not necessarily. Your default's already set that way, so it showed those in your script. And you'll notice a little difference here in that it created the table similar to like I did, but you see it put square brackets around each of the field names and such. That just ensures that there's no mistypos or and the approach that the field names start and stop there. Same with the data types, but you see the identity column is done there. What they did is they put in the starting of 100, 1, because that's what I created that other table, which you can see in my video using the designer, with a starting point of 100 with a as a seed, and then an increment of 1. And then the last thing to note is this creates the primary key a little different. It does it as a constraint. So constraints in SQL Server can be rules, essentially. Think of them as there can be business rules and logic, there can be primary key logic, and there can be things like foreign keys also. So essentially this constraint is saying, create a constraint, call it PK underscore table students, and PK, I basically short script for primary key. And it's saying it's a primary key constraint, and it's clustered, which with SQL Server, if you get further into it, you'll learn about indexes, and there's clustered and non-clustered indexes, and you're allowed one clustered index, which typically always gets applied to your primary key, and it's on the field student ID, and it's sorting ascending. So those are the extra things that the engine puts in, and then some of the other default settings that were here with SQL Server, when I created that through the designer, it put them all in parts of the script. So the script looks far more complex than the one that I wrote by hand, but you can use this, and you could clean it up and make it simpler. You could get rid of some of these default settings. They don't need to be in there. But we could also tweak this, and when you change an existing script, just be careful. Make sure you change and update everything accordingly. So if I said my faculty structure was pretty much the same, little difference is the table name is going to be faculty, and then it's going to be faculty ID here instead of student ID. Then additionally, the PK is actually going to be on this table name, so I can copy and paste here accordingly. And then the field name that the primary key I'm specifying is no longer student ID, it's faculty ID. And then just, again, read the script, make sure everything else is the way you intended it to be and makes sense for the structure you're creating. Be very careful. Don't recommend utilizing scripts or utilizing code that you haven't taken the time to fully understand. So if this looked foreign to you and more complex than the create table statement that I created, take the time to understand what's happening here. And before you execute it. So we know we're using the database that I want to create this object in here. Then we have a bunch of settings, and then we have the create table statement with the primary key, the name of the primary key that's going to get built, and then some of the other default settings and all. The other thing I just want to call out to the attention with the SQL script, again, Microsoft not always been best known for sticking to best practices in writing various language components. You'll see they never terminated any of their lines with a semicolon, but what they did, they used the go statements. So basically, run this command. Go means to just basically execute it, move on to the next one. So they use go instead of the actual line termination of a semicolon. A little difference again from what I explained. So in this case, what I would do, again, recommend Control A, highlights everything, or just use your mouse and highlight everything, and then click execute. And if all goes well, the commands will be completed successfully again. We can go over here and right click and refresh. And you'll see now that we have the faculty. If we expand our columns, we see faculty ID and then the according fields. You also see that you have the primary key set. And then just going further here, we can expand keys. You can also see the name of that primary key that's created. So TBL faculty. We could have done the same with any of our other tables and entities. And there's no constraints, even though that was considered a constraint in our script, but it's really a constraint that's also known as the primary key that's there. So this concludes your brief tutorial on approaches to creating tables using SQL scripts, either from scratch or by generating an existing script and modifying it. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them below. Consider subscribing to my channel, and you could also reach out to me by going to ProfessorWolfe.com. Thank you.